Picture this: 4 young guys from Liverpool strumming guitars in smoky clubs, dressed in leather jackets and eating chicken between songs. Sounds like just another band, right? But these weren't just any guys, they were the Beatles, the band that would change music forever. What if I told you their journey wasn't all screaming fans and catchy tunes? There's a hidden side to their story full of rebellion, controversy, and moments that shaped history. Stick with me until the end of this video, because I'm diving deep into the untold truth about the Beatles, and trust me, you don't want to miss a single second of this. Let's start at the beginning, long before they were global superstars. The Beatles were just a group of scrappy kids playing in dingy nightclubs in Liverpool and Hamburg. Back then, they were far from the polished pop stars we know. They wore jeans and leather jackets, smoked on stage, swore, and even munched on fried chicken mid-performance. Can you imagine that? The Fab Four chowing down on drumsticks while belting out early rock and roll covers. They were raw, unpolished, and full of attitude. But that rebellious vibe caught the eye of one man who would change everything: Brian Epstein. He saw something special in these rough-around-the-edges lads. He believed they could be more than just a local act, but they needed a serious makeover. Out went the greasy chicken and gritty style, and in came sharp suits, clean haircuts, and a polished image. It wasn't easy for the band to ditch their bad boy ways. John Lennon himself once said they had to choose: keep the chicken routine, or go big. They chose to go big, and that decision set them on the path to stardom. Now, let's talk about a night that changed the Beatles forever. It was 1964, and they were already making waves with hits like I Wanna Hold Your Hand. Enter Bob Dylan, the folk legend who met the band one fateful evening. Dylan heard their song and thought the lyrics hinted at getting high. Spoiler alert, they didn't. It was a total misunderstanding. But Dylan saw an opportunity. He introduced the Beatles to marijuana that night, and let's just say it was a game changer. The room filled with laughter, and the band was, well, a little out of it. Paul McCartney later said he felt like he was discovering the meaning of life, scribbling notes he swore were pure genius. Spoiler again, those notes were gibberish when he read them the next day. This wasn't just a funny story, it marked a shift. The Beatles started experimenting not just with substances, but with their music, leading to the trippy, groundbreaking sounds of albums like Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. That one night with Dylan opened a door to a whole new creative world. Speaking of creativity, have you ever noticed that almost every Beatles song is credited to Lennon-McCartney? It's iconic like a brand name, but there's a story behind it. Early in their career, John Lennon and Paul McCartney made a pact, pushed by their manager, Brian Epstein. They agreed that any song either of them wrote would carry both their names. Sounds fair, right? At first, Paul was okay with it, as long as the order flipped depending on who did most of the work. For example, if Paul wrote the song, it'd be McCartney-Lennon. But that flipping never happened. Every song, whether it was a solo effort or a team masterpiece, ended up as Lennon-McCartney. For Paul, this was a mixed bag. On one hand, he saw it as a catchy logo, like Rodgers and Hammerstein. On the other, it bugged him, especially for songs like Yesterday, which he wrote entirely on his own. Can you blame him? Imagine pouring your heart into a song and sharing credit forever. After the band broke up, Paul tried to switch things up, suggesting they alternate credits. Yoko Ono, John's wife, seemed open to it at first, but for reasons we don't fully know, it never happened. That Lennon-McCartney label remains one of the most famous partnerships in music history, but it wasn't always as harmonious as it seemed. Let's shift gears to a moment that showed the Beatles' heart. In 1964, during their U.S. tour, they arrived at the Gator Bowl in Jacksonville, Florida, ready to perform. But there was a problem. The audience was segregated, with black and white fans forced to sit apart. This was the reality of the time. But the Beatles weren't having it. John Lennon was especially vocal, saying they'd rather lose their fee than play to a divided crowd. Imagine the courage it took to take that stand in the 1960s. Their refusal paid off. The organizers caved, and the audience was allowed to mix. The Beatles took the stage, and that night became more than just a concert. It left a mark on Paul McCartney, who later wrote Blackbird, inspired by the civil rights movement. That song, with its simple beauty, became a powerful anthem for equality. It's a reminder that the Beatles weren't just about music, they stood for something bigger. But not every stand they took went smoothly. In 1966, John Lennon sparked a firestorm with a single comment. In an interview with the London Evening Standard, he said, "Christianity will go. It will vanish and shrink. We're more popular than Jesus now." In England, it barely raised an eyebrow. But when those words were reprinted in an American teen magazine called Datebook, all heck broke loose, especially in the South. People misunderstood John's point. He wasn't attacking faith. He was commenting on fame and society. Still, the backlash was intense. Fans burned Beatles records, radio stations banned their music, and protests popped up at concerts. The Vatican even condemned them. Things got so bad that the band faced death threats. During one show, a loud bang later found to be a cherry bomb made them think someone had opened fire. That scare was the final straw. The Beatles decided to stop touring for good. It was a tough call, but their safety was on the line. Tragically, this controversy had a darker echo years later. Mark David Chapman, a former fan turned born-again Christian, later said Lennon's words fueled his hatred. In 1980, that hatred led to John's murder. It's a chilling reminder of how words can ripple through time. Let's lighten things up with a wild story about an album cover that never was. In 1966, the Beatles planned a bold cover for their Yesterday and Today album. The image showed them posing with doll parts and raw meat, a shocking statement against the Vietnam War. They wanted to push boundaries, but their label panicked, worried it would tank sales. At the last minute, they swapped it for a tame photo of the band sitting around a trunk. A few copies of the original Butcher cover slipped out, and today they're worth a fortune to collectors. It's a classic Beatles move, always daring, even if it didn't always work out. That rebellious spirit defines so much of their career, from their music to their choices. Now, let's tackle one of the biggest myths about the Beatles: the idea that Yoko Ono broke them up. For years, people pointed fingers at Yoko, John Lennon's wife, claiming she swooped in, convinced John to leave, and ruined everything. It's such a common story that Yoko became shorthand for anyone blamed for splitting up a group. But here's the truth: it's not that simple. Even Paul McCartney has defended Yoko. In a 2012 interview, he said she didn't break up the band and shouldn't be blamed. The Beatles were already fraying. John and Paul, once close partners, were clashing over creative control and personal differences. Yoko gave John the confidence to chase his own path, but the band's tensions were there long before she arrived. Blaming her is an easy story, but it ignores the real struggles within the group. The Beatles didn't fall apart because of one person. They grew apart as people and artists. Here's another wild chapter: the Beatles' first encounter with LSD. You'd think it happened at some rock star party, right? Nope. In 1965, John Lennon, George Harrison, and their partners were at a dinner hosted by a dentist friend of George's. This guy, nicknamed the Wicked Dentist, spiked their coffee with LSD without telling them. His plan was probably to liven up the night, but the group left before the effects kicked in. Later, as they drove through London, the drug hit hard. George felt euphoric, like he was floating. John, on the other hand, saw a red traffic light and thought it was a fire. He even hallucinated that George's house was a submarine he was steering. It's a bizarre story, but it marked the start of the Beatles' experiments with LSD, which influenced albums like Revolver and Magical Mystery Tour. Their music got weirder, bolder, and more psychedelic, thanks to that sneaky dentist. Let's talk about something that might surprise you. None of the Beatles could read or write music. That's right, the band behind some of the greatest songs ever didn't know musical notation. John Lennon admitted this in a 1980 interview, saying they weren't technical musicians. Paul McCartney backed this up in 2018, explaining that they relied on instinct and creativity. Think about that. Songs like Hey Jude and Let It Be came from pure talent, not formal training. They'd hum melodies, play chords by ear, and build masterpieces together. It's almost unbelievable that a band with no musical schooling changed the industry forever. They pioneered new recording techniques, like layering sounds and using studio effects that are now standard. Their lack of training didn't hold them back, it set them free to break all the rules. The Beatles' breakup in 1970 left fans desperate for a reunion. One of the closest calls happened in 1976, during an episode of Saturday Night Live. Producer Lorne Michaels made a tongue-in-cheek offer: $3,000 for the Beatles to perform 3 songs. Here's the crazy part: John Lennon and Paul McCartney were both in New York that night, watching the show together. They toyed with the idea of showing up, just for laughs. Can you imagine the Beatles reuniting on a comedy show for the price of a used car? Sadly, they were too tired and passed on it. It's a bittersweet what-if moment. One of the greatest reunions in music history almost happened but didn't. That night reminds us how human they were, even at the height of their legend. Let's wrap up with a story from the post-Beatles years. In the mid-1970s, during John Lennon's so-called lost weekend, he was living apart from Yoko Ono, diving into a chaotic mix of music, drinking, and drugs in New York and LA. One day in 1974, he ran into Paul McCartney at a studio in Burbank, California. It was a random, emotional moment. The two old friends who'd been through so much together jammed for a bit, rekindling memories of their Beatles days. It wasn't a grand reunion, but it was a reminder of their bond, even after the band's messy split. Moments like that Show the human side of the Beatles, not just icons, but friends navigating life's ups and downs. The Beatles weren't perfect. They faced controversies, made mistakes, and dealt with struggles like anyone else. But their music, their courage, and their creativity changed the world. From smoky clubs to sold-out stadiums, from chicken-eating rebels to polished superstars, their story is one of talent, heart, and a little bit of chaos. They stood up for what was right, pushed boundaries, and left a legacy that still inspires artists today. So, what's your favorite Beatles song? Drop it in the comments below, and let's keep the conversation going. If you loved this deep dive into their untold story, hit that like button, subscribe, and ring the bell for more videos like this. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.